Dear students, in this module, we are going to cover various criticisms on demographic transition theory. It is very important as part of learning objectives. This module will focus on how to become familiar with some of the criticisms of the demographic transition theory from the initial versions onwards, and we will focus on important issues. For instance, issues related to the criticisms with respect to the role played by institutions of marriage, how the delays in marriage have rendered in the reduction in the fertility level, which has an important influence on total fertility rate. There are significant differences in total fertility rate worldwide, which have led to the major discussions around it. For instance, how due to differences in the share of women of reproductive ages worldwide, and whether it is married or in cohabitation, or the significant differences that existed in marital fertility, possibly due to the various practices of breastfeeding and use of contraceptives among the different societies that have been noticed, is some of the issues that have been made to debate. The various causes that led for these debates are too much emphasis on socio-economic factors, especially the economic ones. For instance, industrialization influencing fertility trends is a major issue of highlighting about how opportunity costs of having children will be influenced by the fertility decline, and also it is that fertility decline has a contributory influence through modernization process, so that it allows that there were differences to the role of changing norms and also values that accompany modernization. A 1963 study to explain differences and similarities in fertility levels across 700 European provinces revealed that it is not so in that sense. For example, it is generalized that prediction that all societies with modernization process would experience the demographic transition, but criticized that it could not predict the precise timing of fertility decline. Another aspect which we need to emphasize is on empirical relevance to Europe. For instance, a study conducted on fertility levels varied widely across regions due to differences in marriage and reproductive patterns affected by factors as nutrition and birth control also have been noted as a contributory factors. What are the shortcomings? The theory did not capture new demographic changes post the mid-1960s in Europe, called second demographic transition, for instance, which has arisen due to better methods of birth controls, the growth of the welfare state, and changing preferences and tastes. They are all contributed well for making it to happen, so that below replacement level in the fertility levels have occurred. What happens in the case of developing countries? In the case of developing countries, better but more easily available techniques and tests of the theory in developing countries, assumptions could be reconsidered. Some differences between 19th century Europe and developing countries are pointed out in terms of delayed or rapid transition as of 1975, which is highly relevant today. For instance, there is a delayed transition where developing countries faster due to imported technologies rather than indigenous development, which may be lesser impact of fertility. So, the faster rate of demographic transition started happening instead of delayed transition. Whereas in the case of Europe, slow and related to modernization process generally led to the pace and source of mortality decline. So, in the case of developing countries, this early marriages and non-marriages not being common in developing countries, fertility levels were far higher before they declined. 19th century Europe, where marriage patterns tended to be late and where many did not marry, is another issue that needs to be focused. In the case of international migration, is another issue that has to be seen. Population increase in 19th century Europe led to migration overseas. Migration to upset population is more difficult in modern times. It can grow more rapidly in a shorter span of time than it was possible in 19th century Europe. Population growth rate is another issue which leads to difficult investment choices, necessities and social needs versus industry and agriculture, affects development and movement through the transition. We need to know about the momentum for future growth also. Population growth in developing countries would gain momentum through a younger age structure, leading to further growth through children and grandchildren. True, even if short-run fertility levels would become characteristic of developed countries with low fertility, will more easily observed in that time in Europe as there were other available opportunities. It may be more difficult in developing countries as demand may be very high, not easily observed. Few opportunities for female participation in the labor force is another issue that needs attention. In 19th century Europe, one factor of fertility decline was women entering in the labor force in high numbers. In developing countries, rapid population increase would mean that the labor force would grow faster, demand for female labor would be limited in its growth due to discrimination amongst other factors. Difficulties in providing universal education in this aspect also requires considerable attention by us. Given the increase in population, school-going children would also increase rapidly. The ability of developing nations to provide the growing number of children with education may be constrained, impacting the spread of education for all, which also impacts fertility levels. The aspect of rapid transition, phase of social and economic development, more rapid rate than at 19th century Europe, affecting the pace of marital fertility decline, completing the transition faster. As discussed before, the methods of fertility control is another issue that requires the attention. A decline in fertility in the European experiences was due to more traditional birth control methods. However, many developing countries have safe, effective, improved methods available, affecting frequency of usage, effects, impacting demographic variates for its faster to the greater extent. Non-marriages were common to the European experience. In that way, fertility transition based mostly on reduction of marital fertility. In developing countries, early ages of marriage and commonality of marriage fertility would be reduced through these aspects, which have ultimate influence on the situation. Also, larger families were common in 19th century Europe, but due to factors such as communication overseas and larger trade networks, there were increased tendencies towards the small family. What about international assistance, its role played? Now, international organizations such as the United Nations provide assistance which can enhance the speed of development, supplementing any local shortages. In this context, it is very important for us to deliberate on the development as a relative. There are many different understandings of development discussed earlier in our modules. One common understanding is related to the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals. Many Commonwealth less developed countries compared to those outside are more poor and slower in progress, particularly with regard to human development indicators. Explanations include decades of colonial exploitation and parliamentary style governing apparatus. Countries with the presidential system have progressed faster in terms of life expectancy and human development, example as in the case of Brazil and Taiwan. Government measures are expected to impact the speed of demographic transition and human development index more in essential areas as education and social security rather than by economic growth alone. What are the methodological issues in this regard? Theory has been critiqued for being general, accommodating a variety of theoretical and causal relations, difficult to argue against or specify causal relations without ambiguity. One of the issues are three types of classifications. Classification 1. From related theories, criticism was that what is termed a process of change is really only different types of classifications. Classification 2, abstractly useful but not for an empirical study of change at any particular point of time in history, which requires more specificity. Classification 3, also not considered relevant or useful, are the examples of a modern system as having evolved from an example today of a system considered traditional. The demography of 1960s, quantitative social science, especially statistical models, and they are very complex, yet accessible, affordable, but with limitations. It did not look into the causation as deterministic relations to be fulfilled with certainty, but only in the likelihood or probability that such relations would exist. But such analyses have come to be seen as inevitable. Although the theory offered a single evolutionary path, it was not historically inevitable. A society could also remain in early transitional stages without moving forward. Viewed at the time, policy could facilitate that movement and needed to do so. For Notistian, the theory indicated what should happen, prescribed policy measures for such advancement irrespective of context. The explanation method, conditions outlined ahead of time, a closed system, carefully scaled cause-effect relations for prediction. However, alternative philosophies and methodologies may be better given the many relationships and phenomena as values and meanings not explained easily, context-specific, slow, careful projects on fertility change may be better in this regard. Malini Karkal way back in 1992 brought out that sexist conceptualizations, politics of Western developed countries is another issue that needs the demographer's attention. Demographers statistically discussed population issues as population size, assigning it to social structure problems, comparing with industrial countries, and thereby controlling population through programs to reduce birth rates rapidly, impacting third world people and women. In that context, family planning programs efforts to control female fertility and reduce birth rates, increasing women's oppression through research by professional trained demographers assisted by the medical profession is some of our views that I have expressed in that context. An example of exploitation between industrial countries and the third world, rich and poor, between racial groups and two sexes, through local governments and international organizations also is to be emphasized in this regard. Fertility focused on controlling female fertility as a solution to population growth, not easy or safe methods, and putting pressure on and requiring sacrifices of women to accept contraceptives rather than their husbands, together with the traditional breadwinner housekeeper models, is to be emphasized. As part of the Industrial Revolution, we need to understand that Second World War affected financial, social conditions of European countries, US are also not very impacted. Economic and social conditions of First World countries were significantly improved through sources from the Third World, reduced through independence in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But as these countries were also impoverished, needed financial and technical help to improve conditions, which the US was a primary source. With regard to foreign policy, leading social scientists persuaded US government that population growth in Third World would harm American interests through a rising voice in international affairs, which led to main foreign policies supported by US government, financial inputs and arguments, research and professional growth towards this end. Private and public population agencies controlled by US funding interests, which did not address health problems of women and children. The other aspect is about the multidimensional issues. By focusing solely on population, it misses out on issues of poverty, environmental degradation, and economic and political dislocations. By focusing on gender, race, and class issues were averted, that is, focus on women's education, but not on land reform, redistribution of economic and political power, or international debt. In that sense, it is very important for us to deliberate on the issues that are existed on the criticism that led to the demographic transition. The impact of the demographic transition As we have seen, the declining birth rates over time affects population age structure and speed of population aging increases. Impact would be as follows. Declining death rates, mostly at youngest ages, birth rates continue to be high, which is considered to be stage 1. The population of children increases, with this effect increasing child dependency ratios and younger populations lasting for several decades. When it is not expected, government and families can find it difficult to provide for, as in terms of education. In the stage 2, its impact can be seen like this. Declining birth rates, child dependency ratios also begin to fall under below pre-transitional levels. Working age population increases, becomes greater than total population, leading to a decline in total dependency ratios lasting close to half a century. Benefits: if enough jobs, an advances situation called demographic dividend played an important role in the boom of several Asian tiger countries. This is what is stage 2 about. In the case of countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan also have shown these effects. Elderly population grow rapidly due to increasing longevity and low levels of fertility, which is considered to be in stage 3. Therefore, growth rate of working age population slows down, old age, total dependency ratios rise fast. What about migration? Migration occurs to relieve population growth pressures, impacts regions of origin and settlement, particularly the labor market and population age structure, as most migrants tend to be working age. What are its benefits? Low fertility countries in reducing population aging and remittances by those migrated, impacting families, communities in the country of origin, aid in reducing poverty are some of these issues. Migration process have been linked to stages of the demographic transition process. In module 4, as we saw that pre-modern traditional society, which is mostly as having a circular migration, characteristic of high birth and death rates, little natural population increase, early transition society, where international migration is one of the issues, and through which rapid decline in death rates, sizable population growth occurs, and later transitional society, where significant decline in fertility, significant but decreasing rate of natural population increase occurs. In advanced societies, fertility and mortality become stable at low levels of slight population increase, if any. Rural-urban migration continues, although reduced, and more residential urban and circular migration increases significantly. In future advanced societies, continuing low fertility and mortality is a characteristic, and urban internal migration, residential, circular movements, a decline due to better communications, transport, declining immigration of unskilled labor will continue. The population in Vietnam, for example, it increased by 11% between 2006 to 2016. Mostly they are all from the European countries. What is its impact on networks? Networks are affected as birth rates decline and life expectancy increases. Kin networks become smaller and have a greater generational span. That is, fewer extended family as parents, grandparents and great-grandparents become important, unlike earlier stages of the transition. Increase in life expectancy leads many to seeing great parenthood and great grandparenthood in many industrial countries. Amount of time in life spent as a grandparent has also increased, such that grandchildren will have grandparents well into childhood and adolescence, and even into adolescent. Children born first born parents will have grandparents for a longer time of life than children in a later order of birth. As life expectancy has increased, families have fewer children, older persons are increasingly childless, which leads to issues of caregiving, as children were the main source of support in old age. Familial support remains important, and when not available, other sources such as public care in many countries are relatives, neighbors and friends. Formal care expected to increase as family networks become smaller, and with greater distance amongst persons may be available in developed countries, but will need to be started or enhanced in developing countries. Caregiver are also impacted. Limitations to informal and formal care. Not receiving care when needed, leads to other issues involving high dependency of elderly, for which feasible alternative types of care is necessary. Elderly who are minorities or migrants face several additional difficulties in addition to age, including accessibility to support systems and services due to discrimination and other barriers accruing in later years. This is another important aspect of reproductive advancements. Impact women's role in society more generally. When birth and death rates decline in early stages, family size initially increases until decisions regarding children took effect to maintain the desired family size. As a result, parental investment in children in terms of time, care and education, especially for mothers, increases than what was possible when high child mortality rates led to fertility reduction. And because there were fewer children and increased longevity, there was time for other activities, changing women's roles and society as well. Age of marriage and time of life spent on children depended on context. Increase in life expectancy is another issue that requires attention. Better nutrition and public health innovations, population health and life expectancy increases, and as early as in 2015, life expectancy birth, which was around 68.6 years, is expected to increase to 70.7 years, where females will have 66.6 years and where males will be in the relatively lesser in number. Regional differences are also noticed in life expectancy. Similar is the case wide sex differences. Longevity at older ages, partly due to mortality decline at younger ages and amongst the oldest and old females, is another important issue. Earlier, extra year were mostly during youth and working ages and a smaller percentage after 65, but in many high-income countries now, added years come after 65. The socio-economic impact is also another important aspect. People may work for longer, savings investment decisions change, and social institutions adapt accordingly. So, later stages of the transition require greater policy support to sustain a link between these aspects. Links life expectancy to good health and well-being through health, particularly for last years. Catering to the socio-economic and health needs of a growing number of elderly will be challenging. In India, measures taken in this regard include a focus on maintaining the joint family system to be able to provide care to the rising proportion of elderly in the country. In that sense, population aging is here to stay. Longer life expectancy and lower birth rates lead to population aging. Population aging used to be considered particularly in developed countries, but there is going to be a manifold increase in both developed and developing countries. And when population aging arises out of reduced fertility, the resources cost to society with or without institutions to provide old age support is an important cause of concern. Whereas in the case of decreased mortality, health and functionality of elderly tends to improve, affecting pension schemes and retirement age considered as an institutional problem, not a societal resource-oriented problem. Similar is the case that when sex-wise differences are seen, females across regions have higher median ages than males, given differences in mortality levels and life expectancy. What are the issues related to population decline? Due to high death rates, low birth rates and net emigration, benefits of a larger population, economies of scale, specialization and division of labor also affect the base supporting large-scale infrastructure and investment needs. And also it has a linkage between population and labor force. Due to growing population, growing labor force occurs and also higher GDP can be obtained. These are some of the issues. In the area of economic and political power, population size is seen to determine the size of political power due to increasing investments, but smaller countries often form alliances to increase influence, have the same vote as the biggest countries in international bodies. What about productivity? Not impacted by population size alone, but also through innovation, smaller countries may export more per capita GDP than larger countries in the same phase of development. Many technical innovations have arisen out of smaller countries, may also lead to increased efficiency due to confronting labor shortage and investment in worker training and welfare to observe those not in the labor force. Another aspect is related to food security. Although it seems that smaller population may enable achieving food security easier, This is increasingly difficult as abundant food supply is no longer a reality exacerbated by climate change and population growth across the world. What about infrastructure? Infrastructure related is also important. When population initially declines and there is no change to the existing stock of capital, as with transport and infrastructure, then there will be higher stock of capital per person until it needs to be replenished when there will be higher cost per person. Therefore, short run, a small reduction in population might make transport systems better, but in the long run, given high cost of infrastructure investment, there may be little benefit from population decline. Another aspect is related to investment. When there is less certainty about the extent of decline, investing becomes more difficult. Given the risk of building to less capacity that needed, as greater capacity becomes wasteful. Investments type may also shift as the economic structure shifts with the population decline. Slower output may result in a shift from investment to counter consumer goods and public services. If there is a sudden decline, the economy may find it difficulty for adjusting. A fast-growing economy may lead to innovation, although it is also possible that new types of demands may encourage innovation. What about the environment? Population decline would reduce intensive agriculture practices and encroachment practices in wilderness and coastal areas, and pollution especially from households. Climate change is affected by population levels which would be impacted significantly. But when the purchasing power of the population increases significantly, irrespective of changes in population size, population decline may have only a minor impact on the environment. Also, we need to address the issues related to urbanization. Increasing urbanization either through rural-urban migration or urbanization of localities and rural areas may bring about opportunities for labor force, but also exerts heavy pressure on the environment. Education sphere also has a contributory factor. Growing population of school-age children will impact measures needed to expand, enhance, and make affordable educational facilities, affecting overall educational attainment and gender disparities. Impacts working together also has an important in the first stage. For instance, countries characterized by high population growth rates and a high total fertility rate, such as in Cambodia and Nepal, primary hurdles would involve providing basic education to growing numbers of children and employment to those entering into the labor force. Countries characterized by higher population growth, low fertility rates, and as Iran and Vietnam, problems similar to the first stage are also experienced as noticed in the second stage. Also, the need to provide employment to those already in the labor force, impact of low fertility on women's lives, widening capacity of women to participate in the labor market need to be catered to the minimized gender disparities in education and labor force, which are all the characteristics that is noticed in the second stage. In the case of third stage, countries towards the end of the demographic transition, such as Singapore and Sri Lanka, have a characterized by low negligible rate of growth of population and below replacement level of fertility, which are primarily face issues that accompany an aging population and gender disparities, which will need to be prepared for and minimized. These issues will also face those countries that are currently in the second stage of transition. In that way, the impacts are huge and they are complex. At the end, I would like to stress upon that the impacts of demographic transition in each of the component, fertility, mortality and migration and overall population growth are very critically we need to see, because each aspect its influence and also the effects are of varying nature. While fertility aspects that are impacted due to the demographic transition may be of different nature when we compare with that of mortality and also that of migration. That is why when a demographic transition occurs, one aspect which we need to address is what are the contributory factors for this transition, and if the transition occurs, what are the possible issues that are to be taken care of while the demographic transition is going to impact differentially and also not uniformly when we are talking about each component of demographic transition like fertility, mortality and migration. So these are important things which we need to address while talking about impact of demographic transition.